Sound, music, sustainability. Welcome to Sustain FM. Hello and welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Steve Williams, Drew's Noise, and today we're talking about hearing hidden noise with Felipe Vareschi. It sounds simple, but what is noise? Is it unwanted sounds? Is it a set of frequencies? Or is it something that's all around us, but something we don't usually notice? Today we talk with Felipe about their compositions and performances that give voice to the quietest and most hidden forms of noise pollution that affect us as individuals and as groups coexisting within urban spaces. We talk about sound, noise, listening, and the potentials of sound as a medium for possible futures, and of the artist as the enabler for these kind of possibilities. So let's get into the conversation, and we'll hear a couple of excerpts from Felipe's performances too. All right, so today I'm happy to chat with Felipe Vareschi. Felipe is an experimental electronic musician, performer, and master engineer based in Berlin. Their work explores the way people interact with each other through objects, with a particular focus on the interactions between individuals, technology, and nature. So welcome to the show, Felipe.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the chat. And actually, maybe before we get into some of the sound pieces, your bio mentions a few things: experimental electronic musician, performer, mastering engineer. But I know you're an educator too, and I'm curious about that. So, in all of those roles, you're working with sound, but I imagine in quite different ways, from performing and mastering and teaching. I'm curious, what's different for you when you're thinking about those roles and thinking about sound, and what stays the same?
Yeah, so I mean, as I guess many creative practitioners, we end up doing a lot of things. It's very rare now that we focus on only one super narrow practice. But I think this is
Mm-hmm.
also kind of a beautiful thing because we get to explore a much wider range of activities than we would otherwise have to. Like, I really enjoy that there's this feedback loop between all of these different practices in my life. Like my education work influences my artistic practice influences my engineering, and they all kind of feedback into each other. I think the one thing that I try and keep the same between all of these different fields is, especially the more time goes on, the more this becomes true, is like a collaborative aspect to my work. Like,
Okay.
of course, in education, right, collaboration is fundamental, although a lot of more traditional education is this kind of frontal, filling a vessel with knowledge kind of activity. And
Right.
to me,
More of
collaboration
a
is more
one-way kind of thing.
yeah. And to me, collaborating means really just the network between individuals and groups. Like, you take from me, I take from you, we give to each
Mm-hmm.
other, we become something bigger together. And I like to kind of, whether it's a more formal education structure or something like a workshop that's a bit more informal, I still really enjoy kind of seeing where me and the quote unquote audience can meet in the middle. And that's, of course, also true with my performance work. I really believe, like, if I'm not engaging people, then I'm not really performing, right? Then I might as well just be in my room twiddling with knobs and buttons. But when I'm on stage, I really like to connect and get what the audience kind of take the expectations that the audience has of me and kind of put that back into the music. And that also goes for the engineering side. Like, I don't want to, I think, like, as electronic musicians, especially, we've become very accustomed to working alone. Like, we're in these caves with our toys. Like, we don't see anybody, and then we do all of this work. That's kind of like looking inwards. But fundamentally, music is a social experience, and even sound, it's a social phenomenon. So I like to keep kind of collaboration going through all of these streams. What is different, at least for me, in all of these different parts of my practice, is kind of where my focus lies. In my engineering work, I really try to concentrate on being very detail oriented, focusing in on kind of the sound primarily. Of course, things like concept and context are there, but the main thing I'm being asked to work on is the sound, because that's what the
Hmm.
artist needs from me. Of course, if I can engage with the kind of nature of their work, that's even better. But primarily, I'm working on the sound. But when I'm performing, sound quality is one thing, but kind of performative spectacle is much more important to me than sound quality. I might have a very big interest in sound quality in general, but that kind of dies off a little bit during the
Hmm.
performance. I think there's more important things for me um, to notice there. And with education as well, I used to kind of I've been on a journey. I used to uh, focus a lot on giving kind of complete, um, accurate to the fullest extent that I can be accurate information. But then I realized that my audience, right, people who are interested in learning, um, when you're learning something for the first time, being bombarded with the fullest extent of a topic is probably not very digestible to you.
Hmm.
And what's actually much, much more important is to kind of keep the spark of curiosity alive.
Hmm.
Um, so when I'm teaching or when I'm doing educational work, um, of course I'm trying to deliver concepts, right? I'm trying to teach people useful things, uh, but I kind of keep this attitude of like, if you want to go super duper deep and get the fullest kind of technical precision done, you can do
Hmm.
that. I'm happy to give you the resources. But right now, I just want to spark your creativity and see how the thing I'm interested in talking about can connect to your own artistic practice.
Hmm. That's very interesting. I mean, it connects to some of the this podcast is all about sound, music, and sustainability, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But one of the things that came to mind as you were talking about that in that sort of collaborative relationship, I wonder how that extends potentially even to the sounds you use or the way you create compositions. Because if I think about it as a researcher, for example, doing sustainability research, the traditional way is you would go into a community and extract research. You go in, interview people, make some recordings, do some stuff, and then publish that in an academic journal that none of the participants have the money to read. None of them subscribe to those journals. So it's like taking and then going somewhere else. And we can also think about that with audio in terms of how we're collecting field recordings or engaging the audience. It can be very much I'm going to extract energy from the audience and I'm going to use it. I'm going to extract sounds, I'm going to use them. Or it sounds like you're talking a bit more of a collaborative, almost like ecosystem approach to that. Does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah. So to me, the the way that I see this topic is, I mean, sound is a resource in a
Hmm.
way, but the one really cool thing about sound is that it's always there, whether you want it, whether you
Right.
really want it, or you really don't want it to be there.
Right.
It will
Right.
be there, and it will continue to be there, like for forever. As long as we can hear, there will be sound, and even if when we can't hear, and the sounds that we can't hear, they're still there, and they're still
Hmm.
having, still kind of existing. Um, so I think I feel very fortunate as a sound artist that we just have this amazing resource all around us, right? That we all kind of share. But the moment where there can be kind of a breakdown in this collaboration is, you mentioned, right? You can go into a community, you can extract research, but then when it comes to publishing, and I would call this communicating, um,
Hmm.
there's then this big disconnect. And the same thing I think happens in sound, especially with the more experimental audio stuff. Like
Hmm.
um, dance music, for example, is very successful at engaging audiences, at building a culture and creating real strong relationships between music enjoyers, music makers, the places where this music is created and consumed. It's all a feedback
Hmm.
loop. Um, and I love academia and everything, but the experimental audio kind of side of thing has a strong tendency to alienate people, um,
Hmm.
just by virtue of not not taking care in kind of extending an olive branch, right? Like a
Right.
lot of the times with kind of experimental audio pieces or sound installations, the techniques, the aesthetics are very developed.
Hmm.
And I mean that in the sense of there's been years of researchers and artists nobody knows about that have done
Hmm.
really important work and that are moving our language, musical language forward. But I, why should a normal person care about my obsession with this specific French composer from the 1960s?
Right.
They
Right.
can't, and they have no reason to. But it's my job as an artist, I think, to add something new of value that's new to the world.
Hmm.
So when I'm making music, and these days that mostly shows up in performance, um, I try and kind of balance the intrigue and interest of these kind of like newer techniques, newer aesthetics, newer ideas, but still using sounds that are kind of um, how would you say, accessible to as many people as possible, kind of within reason.
Hmm.
So I work a
Right.
lot with sounds of the city, sounds of regular objects. Sometimes when I'm performing in duo, we use kind of sounds of things like water or rice, like staple
Hmm.
food goods, things that everybody can relate to. And by extending the olive branch at the start of a composition or of a process, by just giving you here's sound that you already know, and then subtly, progressively tweaking it and taking creative ownership of it, I feel like not always, right? This depends on the audience as well. But I feel like I can successfully transport somebody
Hmm.
to kind of a new way of understanding these sounds.
That's great. That's I was because that's one of the questions. Actually, it's a good segue to one of the things I wanted to ask you a little bit later, but it's kind of a good time now because one of the questions that I ask in every interview for the artist is exactly this: how do you balance this idea of getting across a message or an idea in a composition performance where if it's so obvious, it sort of feels like a lecture and it's not actually that artistically or aesthetically engaging. But if it's so esoteric and so conceptual that no one has any idea what's going on, that kind of misses the point as well. So that's an interesting approach of sort of starting with the recognizable and then morphing through that. That's interesting. That way to approach that.
Yeah, at least in performance, I found that's really successful. In other mediums, such as installation work, I
Hmm.
found that the best way is to just be there and talk with the audience.
Right. Right.
um, I've done a lot of work in collaboration with dancers, like installations about movement, where we use sensors to transform kind of movement into sound. And the biggest hurdle is that people are scared of entering
Mm.
the installation, and they are
Right.
scared of kind of being on a quote unquote stage and and having sounds happen. Um, but if they enter kind of a state of play where they allow themselves to engage with it, then the most lay person that has nothing to do, like wouldn't go to an arts festival, wouldn't go to a vernissage, is the deepest, has the kind of deepest involvement with the piece all of a sudden.
Right.
But in this format, I find you just have to be there. The artist has to be there to bridge this gap.
Mm.
Otherwise, we end up always kind of um, preaching to the choir, right? I think we do this a lot in more advanced, quote unquote, advanced electronic music. Is our audience is also the people who make the music, so we're
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
we're just like
Literally
it's
preaching to the choir. Yeah.
yeah, we're echo chambering ourselves, and we're
Hmm.
not really going anywhere. And you see this. I think I see this also with kind of social media pushes this microcosm of music, is like islands of musical styles develop and exist and flourish, but
Mm.
in isolation you have entire ecosystems of electronic music. I think that at least in the dance world, the clearest example of this is the whole kind of Goa psytrance
Mm.
family. Like they have super interesting musical developments, and they are a really interesting community, but there's not a lot of feedback between this kind of world of sound and dance culture and the rest of the electronic dance music um,
Mm.
music world. Um,
Right.
but yeah, this is kind of like a crux
Hmm.
of, of being an artist,
Hmm.
um, balancing kind of wanting to say something really advanced, but not wanting to um, alienate people. I think in performance it's easier because of the element of spectacle. Where
Hmm.
I haven't cracked this nut is in recorded music. I am
Right.
very much struggling with making
Right.
recorded music both accessible and interesting.
Hmm.
I don't know if it's possible for me, like whether I'm the problem or the format is the problem or the combination between me and the format.
Yeah, I mean the format is an interesting question. So, and it's actually a good segue into the next because you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned composition, you mentioned performance, you've mentioned installation, and I know a lot of your work has to do with spatial audio, and which is spatial space. There's a connection there, but I'm wondering if you can tell us first a little bit about what spatial audio means, and then I'm curious your thoughts on maybe partly the aesthetic value, but I'm kind of more interested in your thoughts on the value, or maybe potential might be a better word, for that kind of audio to spark different ideas about the future, about possibilities. So yeah, curious if you talk maybe first of all for people that don't know what spatial audio is, maybe a quick capsule of that, and then talk about what you think the value of that might be.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about spatial audio, we need to very quickly differentiate the technology from the the work, like the practice approach.
Hmm.
The word spatial audio, immersive audio, 3D audio, all of these terms these days are also used to define these technologies of essentially anything that goes beyond stereo, anything that goes
Hmm.
beyond two speakers, or um, music that is kind of representing the horizontal plane, what's in front of you and what's left and right of you.
Hmm.
And there we see all of these. I mean, most people will be familiar with this in cinemas. You go to a cinema and you start hearing different sounds behind you than you hear in front of you. That's already a form of kind of spatial audio technology. Um, these are all different amazing, cool technologies being
Hmm.
developed, being put into music, and that have existed for a long time. And this is one thing that's kind of interesting. But the main thing that interests me is working spatially,
Hmm.
as in thinking about not only if we're making music, for example, of course, you can do spatial work with sculpture. You can do spatial work with light, with
Hmm.
gases. You can make like a
Hmm.
smoke installation, essentially.
Hmm.
But I work with music, so this is how I think about it, or with sound. Um, no, I want to think with spatial audio, spatial sound. I think about where is the sound or music being played and how. Right? What's the context of the playback? How are people
Hmm.
listening to it? Where's the venue? What does the playback system look like in the venue? Are there any sounds in the venue already that we can kind of hack and harness? Are there
Hmm.
any sounds, like what are the sounds that the audience has whilst going from their residence or place of work to the venue? Is the venue in the city? Is the venue in the middle of a forest? Right? Like all of
Hmm.
these, there's a site based experience to sound, and this is really a thing that I think about constantly before I perform, before I do any kind of installation. This is like all these things are built for the space that I'm going to be performing in. But secondly, um, I like to work, and this is also what a lot of my workshops are about, is I like to think about sound and electronic sound in space.
Hmm.
Um, Usually with kind of traditional acoustic instruments, we're like, oh, a violin, the concert house. That's the that's the space
Right.
it exists in. We know the context, we know the connotations, we know what a guitar sounds like in a big rock stadium. Um, with electronic music, um, there is no innate default sound, like
Hmm.
space that it has. It's our job as musicians to situated in a real space, but also with electronic music or music played for speakers, we can put one space in another space. I can make a
Right.
cathedral sound like a jazz bar. I can make a jazz bar sound like a cathedral. I can make a
Mm,
jazz bar sound like a space that is mathematically impossible,
mm,
to exist. And this kind of aspect um, of working with electronic sound spatially, this is where I see the opportunity um, for sound in general, but specifically for electronic music, to be like a way of thinking about what the sound of the future
mm,
can. If we don't have images or sounds or representations or descriptions of what a future can be, we can't really imagine it, right?
mm,
The thinking about the future starts from a place of kind of like wild creativity. Um, just think about how visions of the future have changed over time through things like sci-fi novels. You watch one
right.
of the early 1960s sci-fi movies and they have a completely different vision of the future than we
Mm-hmm,
do now. But this vision of the future was created by writers, philosophers, artists, set designers,
mm-hmm,
computer graphics engineers, musicians. And I do really believe that electronic sound specifically is the kind of fastest way to get us from what what is the, what is the sound of the now to what is a possible sound
mm,
of the future. And we've seen this happen over and over in the history of electronic music, especially in dance music. Electro is
mm,
literally the sound of a community in distress, processing their own trauma and imagining a different future, right? Like, what if instead of the transatlantic slave trade having happened, what if instead the transatlantic slave trade transformed into an underwater colony of
mm,
of, of underwater breathing warrior civilization, and we
mm-hmm,
can have this kind of idea of what a future could be, all through just sound, no images.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Uh,
and this is the like through working, at least for me, through working spatially, this is the way I like to address this topic. Like, what is an imagined space? How can we give voice to a space that doesn't exist yet? And the way that I do this is with sound. Visual
right.
artists may do this with sculpture or installations in a room, but I like to do it with this other medium that's, I think, a little bit underutilized generally for
Right.
this kind of future making process.
Okay, great. That's amazing. Okay, so I could literally talk for hours about that, but but instead of that, right now, why don't we give people a bit of a listen to an example of that? So you did a workshop and on spatial audio and also a performance at Sustain Berlin back in October, and we're going to play an excerpt of that recording. Do you want to just set that up for us? What are people going to hear?
Yeah, so this is my piece noise mapping,
Hmm.
which has essentially existed primarily through kind of invitations to play with Sustain Berlin. Like, it's been
Hmm.
developing over quite some time. In this piece, you'll hear recordings that I did in the dead of night, so that I could get the kind of lowest noise floor, like human noise, um, possible, of different areas in Berlin. Um, because I was really interested in this idea of kind of noise pollution, but specifically tracking the kinds of noise pollution that governments usually don't track, but that
Hmm.
are still really, really impactful on our health and on the nature of our communities. So you'll hear some raw kind of playback of these recordings, and then you'll hear me progressively kind of interpret them, respatialize them, relocate them, and have them interact with each other.
Okay, great, great. All right, well, let's have a listen, and we'll come back for some more conversation in a few minutes. Okay, so yeah, that was very interesting to hear, and it is interesting to hear that evolution of that. And I think an example of what you mentioned earlier in the conversation about this idea of the raw and then processed, and giving people that those kind of connections. You talked a little bit um, about the inspiration for the piece, but I know noise is interesting, right? Because I mean, sound versus noise. Yeah, people have written PhD theses on what the differences are. And I think one of the most simplest definitions is noise is unwanted sound, and of course we can critique that and so on. But I'm curious about how your thoughts of the idea of noise pollution, the ideas of voice, where noise is coming from. How are those kind of showing up in the performance? And I know you're working on a new iteration of that as well. So I'm curious how that evolution is progressing.
Yeah, I think noise still has a very bad reputation.
Right.
noise, noise has a PR problem. I think
Yeah, yeah.
electronic musicians are really into noise. We love noise, all of its little details and problems. But amongst the kind of general population, noise has a um, very bad
Mm,
rep. Um, the definition of noise as kind of unwanted sound is really interesting because it moves away from any kind of um, qualitative kind of audio um, sense to the word, but assigns it immediately kind of a social
right.
aspect. Um, but I do think this idea of looking at noise is potentially, I mean, it's a little bit naive, and it's mostly a bit dangerous because
Mm,
unwanted means very different things to very different people.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and I think unwanted also changes over time.
mhm,
Um, right? I think I constantly think about the Italian futurist artist Luigi Russolo, who do you know this
I don't know.
Italian futurists were these kind of amazing, kind of horrible people in the 1920s and 1930s in Italy, who were all about movement, dynamism, the city
Right.
as this new environment for change. They were also incredibly pro-war. As you can imagine, this didn't go really well
Right.
historically. But Luigi Russolo, most of them focused on kind of visual design and architecture, but Luigi Russolo was working with sound, and he built this kind of categorization system of noise to kind of
Mm,
build a language to describe noise. And then he would make performances where on stage you would have a bunch of different kind of motors and machinery making these clanging, banging, rattling, motor bubbling sounds.
mm,
Um, and at the time, um, the Milan crowd did not exactly, like Milan high society did not exactly enjoy these performances. But now a bunch of 16 to 24-year-old art students are absolutely enamored with this kind
mm,
of sound texture. Um, I like to think about noise as just this the kind of ready-made sound product that is around us. This
mm.
idea of
Okay.
there's sound everywhere, um, and to me, what is already there is noise.
Mhm,
And we can make distinctions between what's made by quote unquote nature and what's made by quote unquote humans, right? We like to stretch this dynamic a
mhm,
lot. Like, is once we change the course of the river, is the sound made by the river still natural,
mhm.
or because we
Right.
put
Right.
the river there, is it now a human sound? You know?
Yeah.
Um,
Or if someone's playing a violin, is that a natural sound or unnatural because the human made the violin to be playing? Yeah.
yeah, and the, I think these kind of distinctions are interesting in theory, but they have nothing to do with our experience of sound. Sound is already there. So I like to think about what, at least when I work with noise and think about noise, I think about it as what is already there, right?
Mhm,
Uh, a station where there's always street musicians playing, that's part of the sound of the station. That's part of the
mhm,
sound that's already there. The super quiet perfection with just a light air conditioning hum in a doctor's office. That's the
mhm,
upscale mid to doctor's office. That's the sound um, that's already there. And I'm not really interested in um, changing the kind of structure of the sound, because a lot of the sound that does exist, it has to exist. You
Mhm.
have public transport, you have cars. Like, yes, we can move away from cars, but even all forms of transport will generate some kind of noise.
Mhm.
Electrical generation will generate some kind of noise. If you want nature in the city, well, I hope you like birds, right? I
Mhm.
hope you
Mhm.
like birds chirping and cicadas in the summer. That's part um, of the phenomena. Um, but when I kind of work artistically with noise, what I'm really interested in kind of provoking in the audience is changing the way they listen to the noise.
Mhm.
Um, Oftentimes, I think we can feel very powerless, especially in a city, with like, oh my god, it's so loud, it's so horrible. All these people are talking, and there's music, and there's rumbling everywhere. Um, and you can't do much about it because you can't really escape from the noise. Uh,
Mhm.
but I think what you can do is you can internally imagine the noise away and change the noise so that it becomes more pleasant.
Mhm.
I think I have this experience, and maybe you have it too, where I don't know, you hear like a squeaky escalator at some kind of like tram station or like an airport, and in your mind you immediately, or it's like, oh wow, there's a loop and there's a rhythm, and you can see yourself
Exactly.
dancing to it, and you can see, oh, what's this with delay and what's this with reverb.
Yeah,
You
I've actually totally done. Yeah, like, and yeah, I've recorded the squeaky escalator in Hauptbahnhof in Berlin on my way somewhere. So I'm gonna grab that. That's a great loop. Yeah.
squeaky escalators are amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had that with I took the ferry up to Gothenburg a few days ago, and there was some kind of resonance between the waves and the metal hull and the motor, and at
Mhm.
certain points it would reverberate in a rhythm for a few minutes, and then it would go away. And I don't know
Oh,
exactly what was causing, but there was some combination of air, water, metal, motor that at some points would be in tune and resonate and create
mm.
those rhythmic sounds. So I've got a couple of those loops recorded as well. So yeah, I definitely get that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but and we're used to do this because of kind of our training and our work
Hmm.
as musicians. Um, but I find this process absolutely like magical and life changing. Like
Hmm.
when I'm with my musician friends, or like my friends who aren't musicians but who have co-opted into enjoying noise, and we hear an interesting noise. There's like a moment of silence. We stop talking. We listen to the noise. We appreciate it. And then once the noise is over, like, oh my god, that was a very delightful noise. Um,
Right, right.
and I think that shifting our perspective in the city away from trying to fight noise at all costs and more towards trying to coexist with noise. Um, and because to me, fighting noise generally only means two things. One can, right, if you pedestrianize a neighborhood, right, you're kind of
Hmm.
fighting noise. But pedestrianizing one street means increasing traffic flow in all the adjacent streets. So
Right.
usually it's not a neutral act, right? To and for example, paradoxically, when I did my recording work at nights, um, even though um, super dense urban areas, you would expect them to be quite loud. Um, Equally dense areas with big wealth differences have very different noise floors at
Mm-hmm.
night. Uh, like I've been in the quietest high-rise Berlin center situation at 3 in the morning, and then been in an incredibly noisy suburban working class neighborhood at the edge of town at the
Hmm.
same time of night during the same week, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so reducing noise usually means moving it somewhere else, or I think even worse, sheltering ourselves from the noise, kind of isolating ourselves in inside spaces, not using public space for what it's been designed for, to coexist and exchange with people, but hiding in your little apartment, hiding in your little storefront, right?
Hmm.
Businesses. Um, and that to me is quite damaging to the way I wanna live my life.
Hmm.
And I'm more interested in is like, okay, let's take noise and let's contribute positively to it. If we're gonna have cars, if we're gonna have um, the tram moving, how can we make the inherent sound of it qualitatively more enjoyable, right?
Mm,
There's a lot of things we can do on that front. A lot of interesting architectural decisions are about kind of bringing the outside in and the inside out, for example, right? With
mhm,
thermal design,
mhm,
you can save so much energy by just harnessing the fact that hot air wants to go up,
mhm,
and there's
mhm.
all these interesting new forms of architecture that essentially open up a building to the outside. But we can also do the same with sound. A building can let the outside sound in and let the inside sound out, and create this kind of dialogue between private space and public space.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating. It's wow. Okay. Yes. I would love to keep talking and talking and talking, but we're coming. I want to make sure we have enough time for people to hear some things. So at the end of next week, you'll be performing a new expanded version of this noise mapping piece,
Mhm.
and you've been gracious enough to share a work in progress version that we'll play back in a couple minutes. So maybe just to sort of close us out, what's kind of new here? Where is the expansion? Where is the kind of the new direction going? And maybe you could just set up this excerpt for us so people can hear the next evolution and where the performance is going.
Yeah. So um, I think for me, the next step was just recording a larger diversity of sounds, but
Okay.
specifically recording sounds that are usually not recorded or heard in the traditional sense. Um,
Mm,
Again, a lot of noise pollution data is about the audible range, what we can hear. But there's a lot of pollution and interesting stuff happening below what we can hear and way above
mm,
what we can hear. The research on ultrasonic noise pollution is a little bit spotty. There are some studies on the effects of that it has on human health, but these are not very large. But I still thought it was kind of an interesting thing to look at, this kind of idea of electromagnetic sound in the city. But what does have pretty good research and pretty good understanding is this infrasonic, below the audible range, essentially
mm.
vibration, how
Okay.
these affect living communities. And this is a really tricky problem to solve because, as you know, from standing outside of a club, bass travels very far.
Right.
And infrasonic is just the bassiest bass, the
Hmm.
bassest of bass. Um, so how I expanded the piece is by adding both ultrasonic and infrasonic recordings at the start and the end of the piece, kind of transitioning from sounds that we don't hear but are there to sounds that are there and that we do hear, and then again to sounds don't that we don't hear but we perceive physically at the end of the performance. This talking about the kind of how do you engage audiences makes this a bit more tricky because I'm adding sounds that people haven't heard before.
Hmm.
But my attempt will be to kind of spark that conversation still within the audience of like what do I hear every day, what do I not hear,
Right.
right, through the performance.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing that in the excerpt just now, and also hearing it in live performance. So let's take a listen to that. And thank you very much for the time and the chat. I really enjoyed that, and yeah, literally can't wait to hear what comes next. thanks for listening. And yeah, be sure to check out the show notes for some of the links to Felipe's works and links that they mentioned. Also, if you're in Berlin, come check out Resustain on April 26th to see Felipe perform live, as well as a few other artists all about sound, music, and sustainability. See you next time.